All right, thank you very much. So I think breaking up the Nick and Wayne show is with also gender balance, as Katarina said, and thank you very much, Katarina, for that introduction and the invitation. I'm also differ from these chaps before me, as I am not a medical doctor, so if we have any really very technical medical questions, particularly relating to TUE, I've been guaranteed that one of my colleagues will answer them. But thank you for the invitation. So I'm just going to go through a brief summary about the actual parasport structure. Peter's already given some of that, but this was particularly for our colleagues from ASPATAR rather than the NPC community that are here today. A brief information about the sample collection modifications when we actually do sample collections, which is not a lot. TUE process, education awareness, and a couple of the key issues. I think I went one more. The parasport, whoops, this does go fast. Parasport structure relating to anti-doping. Without going into lots of detail, but the organisations involved include the IPC, we have the parasport specific IFs, as Peter also alluded to, integrated IFs, so some of the sports we have able-bodied and para, impairment-related IFs, and the NPCs. In a little bit more detail, the IPC is the International Federation for 10 of the sports, which means we have the ongoing responsibility, not like the IOC who only have the responsibility during the Olympic Games. So we have an ongoing responsibility for these sports, primarily the summer games, winter games, and the wheelchair dance sport. In terms of the other areas, and again some examples with the able-bodied international federations now taking responsibility for the parasports as well as the able-bodied athletes. Examples there: cycling, tennis, archery, badminton. We have a couple of international federations that are specifically set up for their own specific sport: wheelchair basketball, football 7-a-side, sitting volleyball, just as examples. And then the last group, a couple of sport impairment-based organisations that are still responsible for those sports. There's a large variety. It's a lot more complex than that, than the able-bodied community. And we have a wide range of national Paralympic committees, some of which have very good interactions and good support by their national anti-doping organisations, and others where we understand there's very limited information and support available. So we'll come back to that. All of these organisations previously mentioned, or every single one, is a signatory to the World Anti-Doping Code. That was established in 2003 after the establishment of WADA in 2000. The code itself also sets out mandatory standards, and we're not going to go into these in any detail, but that's just to set that these are mandatory, and we all must follow, all the signatories follow the application of these 5 standards, and each organisation then separately has its own anti-doping rules in response to these code and the standards. And WADA supposedly monitors compliance, and that's an area that I understand they will increasingly put more effort into in the next few years. One of the key documents and the key standard for this group is the prohibited list. It's updated annually around about September or October. I believe the 2016 one has just been released. And every year WADA will review the list, publish it around September, October in preparation for 1st of January of the following year. So it's really important, as in your area, to make sure you stay on top of any of the changes that are taking place and adapt in terms of the athlete's needs around those medications and substances. A lot of this information is available on the WADA website, and if you haven't already got it, that's the WADA website, and a lot of information there. We'll come back to a couple of areas. The IPC Anti-Doping Code, then, our own document, complies with the World Anti-Doping Code, including the standards, and that just is what we use as our umbrella document, outlining all of the rules, processes, the guidelines, the sanctions, result management, and so forth. Just as a broad picture, we do test. There are testing programs conducted at all the Paralympic Games, summer and winter, regional games, and some of the sport-specific events, such as one we are here. Occasionally, sometimes IPC will play a leading role where a number of the sports that are independent hand over the jurisdiction just for the Paralympic Games themselves, so that we don't have multi-organisations trying to manage the one program during a major games. And we also conduct out-of-competition testing. in terms of just a little bit of a picture, this was just a snapshot from the recent laboratory statistics that WADA releases, just to give you an idea of the sort of violations that we see. I'm not going to go into any of the detail, but I think it was just interesting to see the sort of violations that we see in the sport of athletics, seeing we're here. Of course, the original result from the laboratory is called an adverse analytical finding, and that occasionally is then not discarded, but it's acknowledged with a TUE. So they don't all lead to a violation, but that is an indicator of the number of the violations that we're seeing. So adverse analytical findings we see in that sport. And just as another one of our key sports of concern, and one we spend quite a bit of time dealing with, is powerlifting. It's always been an area where we've had quite a lot of findings, and I'm pleased to say that because we have put a lot of work into this sport, that is being reduced, both in our testing and education programs. Just coming to just the key part about sample collection modifications, and I know some of the colleagues in the room I've met mainly in doping control stations when we're collecting samples from your athletes. Basically the process is the same whether you're able-bodied or para, but it is acknowledged that and it's acknowledged in this particular standard, the International Standard for Testing and Investigations. There's actually an annex that acknowledges that there may be modifications required for athletes with an impairment. The premise is that we consider any special needs without compromising the integrity of the sample collection session. Okay, so assistance can be provided by the athlete representative and or the DCO, the doping control officer, sample collection personnel. So it's important that we don't break the rules, our own standards and requirements, but it's important we acknowledge the needs of the athletes. And some examples of modifications that are very regular. We have athletes with their own catheter, and there's a whole IPC policy available on that. I won't go into all the details there, but the athletes can and do use their own catheters. Some athletes present to the doping control station with leg bags, which we require for them to empty as soon as they arrive at the doping control, then wait to develop more urine, and we take the urine from the bag. All right, it's just always we have situations where the athletes do attempt to manipulate whether they're able-bodied or para-athletes, and there's all sorts of devices used these days to actually try and cheat the system. So that is why athletes are always basically naked from knee to chest, and where there's a catheter or a leg bag, we have to be able to see where the actual catheter enters the body. It's very common for the athlete rep and the doping control officer to assist the athlete, and that goes everything from just maybe sometimes pouring the sample into the bottles, or closing the bottles, or even holding the vessel if the athlete doesn't have arms or doesn't have the control to be able to do that. So that's quite common, and we just note that down. So these are the types of modifications that are very, very common, and it's not a problem. Everything's done in front of the athlete. If someone else is pouring the sample, it's done in front of the athlete. We have special requirements for athletes who are minors and athletes who are visually impaired, where they have got the ability for the athlete representative to be in the bathroom area, but they would normally only be observing the sample itself being provided if they're totally blind. Okay, otherwise it's normally for the minor and some of the other visually impaired athletes, they're watching the doping control officer watch the athlete, but not necessarily watching the athlete, and that's for the privacy of the athlete. So there's slightly variations depending on the actual situation, the actual impairment of the athlete. We've had a couple of situations already at these games where we've had athlete representatives wanting to witness the sample being provided, and the athletes don't have these particular impairments. So that's something we do need to get across, that it's really only, as I said, if the athlete is absolutely totally blind, then it's of course for their protection that someone is in the bathroom with them. But if it's not that, then it's we come back from that, and basically the doping control officer will do the observing of the sample. in the bathroom and then come back, and the athlete representative can assist in the rest of the procedure. Okay. Blood, we do blood and urine testing. We've been doing both at these games, and of course if an athlete has no arms and no elbow, then the blood can be taken from another site, and commonly the ankle is used for that. Any of these modifications are recorded on the doping control form. And of course, the athletes get a copy of that form, and we just acknowledge what modifications have taken place. Yep. Moving to the therapeutic use exemption process, and this is available to all athletes tested under the wider code. But it is an area that the IPC led, and we alluded to, my involvement goes back to 96, where it was a time when IPC didn't actually have a staff of Peter's area. There was not actually an IPC medical or anti-doping staff, so some of us were involved in the games back then, and we worked with the committees that they had, and IPC did actually lead the whole TUE process within the wider community. So it's not to say of course there are able-bodied athletes who require a TUE, but it is an area, because of the information we've heard today in terms of athletes' needs, that it was something particularly pertaining to the para-athletes. So there again, with the standard, remember there were 5 different standards, and one of the standards is the International Standard for Therapeutic Use Exemption, and that actually outlines the policies and the processes and so forth that we need to undertake to determine whether to grant a TUE or not. It's not automatic. It's not an automatic process at all. The actual criteria that is involved, each organisation that is managing this particular area will have a TUE committee and have to basically consider these key points. So the athlete would experience significant impairment to health without that prohibited substance. It's highly unlikely to produce an additional enhancement of performance. So the concept is to take them from below par back to par rather than above. There is no reasonable therapeutic alternative, so it is a responsibility to look to see if there is something alternative that can be used that you're comfortable with, and the need is not a consequence of prior doping. So with all of that in mind, then if an athlete does, if you believe as the medical team that the athlete does need treatment with a prohibited substance, and just going on this thing, where is my little pointer? Sorry guys, is the pointer on the bottom? Yep. Whoops. Whoop, whoop, whoop. I had both. Sorry. Okay, so the athlete obviously requires, with the medical doctor, determine if they need a substance. I'm going to try this again. Yep. Prohibited list outlines this whole policy. If the drug isn't prohibited, then the athlete can take the medication. If the drug is prohibited, the substance is prohibited, there's a TUE form, application form, which is sent to the anti-doping organisation for TUE committee review. If it's approved, then obviously the athlete can take the medication. If it's denied, then you would have to determine with the athlete what their next step would be. Obviously, they either do not take the drug and compete, or it's a situation where they can't compete because the drug is more important, whatever they require. Okay, so yes. In terms of the education and awareness then, we have a very large variance within the population, within the Paralympic world, within the able-bodied, within sport. We have, now it is a requirement under the 2015 World Anti-Doping Code. It's actually documented that all signatories are required to develop and implement educational programs for both athletes and support personnel. But of course we see a large variety of application. There are, however, a lot of tools involved. There are a lot of tools available. There are quite a lot of national anti-doping organisations that have put a lot of time and have got the resources, and we can benefit from that. One of the tools that it can be used for your work is this Global Pro. Some of you may have seen it, set up by the UK and Canada, and now used with USADA and JADA, the Japanese. And it's basically where you can put in a substance, a medication, and the system will tell you if it is prohibited or not. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that one. I'll just go back to this slide so that the web link is here, the actual site. And WIDA itself has an awful lot, a lot of tools, sometimes it's a little bit overwhelming, the amount of information that they've got and the toolkits that they put out, for example. And there is now the Sport Physicians Toolkit. I'm not familiar in great detail with that. I'd be interested to know if anyone has used it, or if they've had a look at it and see how good it is and how they can apply it. But these are the toolkits that WIDA have prepared. So basically, for the different areas, coaches, training, program officers and teachers, and this one particular one for sport physicians. So, as I said, it'd be interesting to know if it's how useful it is, and feedback to WIDA if it's not, I guess. One of our biggest problems is supplements, and we see this particularly with a lot of the powerlifting community that we have worked with. And overall, obviously, the recommendation is for athletes not to take supplements. But we know that that's not. I mean, it's easy for us to say that, but it's an area that we are aware that a lot of athletes either seek it, want it, think they need them, and so forth. Obviously, the issue is that they can be contaminated. So unless you're working with a production company, who are absolutely guaranteeing that there is no contamination of the substances, it's something that we generally basically say, please don't use. All right. Now, there are sporting communities, there are countries with resources and teams that have got manufacturers, they have got agreement with manufacturers, and they have got that guarantee. But a lot of these guys are just buying things from the streets, buying things from pharmacy stores with, walk in with the great big tubs of protein powders and all sorts of things. And there's no guarantee of what are the ingredients. The packaging is not necessarily accurate, and it's just an area that we constantly have issues when athletes test positive, and they basically guarantee that they were only taking a supplement, they didn't realise it was banned. It's these days with strict liability, and the new 2015 code has changed from a 2-year sanction to a 4-year sanction. So this has got enormous implications for athletes. I mean, there may well be circumstances where that 4 years can be reduced, but essentially it's a 4-year sanction. So it's really important that athletes are careful about what they ingest and what they take. These are some of the again statements that we've had from athletes. I didn't take drugs. I just went to buy medication in the street for a flu. Okay, and I think the one that Peter had as well. Not this one. Actually, I only use supplements, not drugs. A lot of athletes just don't think. They think that it's not because the doctor didn't give it to them, it's not a drug, and that the supplements aren't drugs or they aren't doping. They're food. There's just not this concept that understanding that it still can contain a prohibited substance and can end in a 4-year sanction. Really, I guess, alluding to the main issues then, a lot of it comes back to this education. We know that some of our athletes are from countries with little or no anti-doping programs, limited, if any, out-of-competition testing, sometimes no education program at all. We have countries that have what I would call good anti-doping programs, including my own country, Australia, where they put very little resources into, for instance, out-of-competition testing for some reason now. So it's often forgotten. It's often it's the second cousin in terms of the actual testing programs. Some countries are tremendous, and I know, having worked even this last couple of days with the athletes here in our out-of-competition testing program, that a number of the athletes have been tested many times. But for many, it's the first time. And it's because the national program hasn't exposed them to either a testing program and hasn't provided education and information. Fast tracking. We had one case a couple of years ago where the athlete, just because his skill, he was fast tracked through from being just basically an athlete through to an elite athlete to a Paralympic Games, missed out on any education, had no idea that what he could and couldn't take, and tested positive. So he'd hardly even started his career, and all of a sudden he had an anti-doping violation. And I think, again, he was let down by his country, and it was a high-level country. So that was disappointing. We've had a couple of athletes more from smaller countries, that we have sitting in a hearing, and we ask them about their knowledge of the prohibited list, and they don't even know it exists. And that's incredible. And that's at a Paralympic Games. So it is really at times an amazing variance between the knowledge and the understanding that we have amongst our athlete population and our support personnel. This was the one that Peter alluded to earlier. I submitted my medication list to my team physician and did not hear from him afterwards, therefore trusted it was safe. Tested positive, it was a Winter Paralympic Games, and he had done the right thing. He'd been asked to provide that list, but the doctor hadn't had time, or the doctor was a volunteer. The doctor didn't have time and didn't provide that feedback. And at that stage, from recollection, I think if he had applied for a TUE, he would have received one. And that was taken into account in the actual hearing, but it was putting the athlete through a pretty frightening situation. I mean, the athlete, I believe, didn't play in the final of the actual competition because of this case. So again, with medical people working with the paras, you do have a responsibility in the role that you're in to be familiar with the code, the standards, the list. They do change. The list changes every year. The code itself changes usually every about 4 years. I realise, again, many of you are volunteers, but it should be a requirement if a team is coming away for athletes to have anything they are taking, any supplement, any substance, any medication checked prior to use. If there isn't an alternative medication, to submit a TUE, but in good time, because it's not automatic that they'll be given approval to use that substance. We've already talked about the doctors, but doctors themselves can be banned and or monitored for poor athlete support. I remember back even in Sydney, which the Games was involved, we had a Russian doctor who'd given one of the gymnasts a banned substance, and he himself was banned for 4 years. I think the athlete was banned for 2. But the doctor was banned for 4 years from representing this country. So, and now with the new code, the new wider code, there's a lot more emphasis on the support personnel and their responsibilities. But as I said, there's also responsibilities for all of the anti-doping organisations to put more time into education. This is very naughty, but this is a very new slide from the wider outreach here, and I don't know who these people are, and I haven't even asked permission, but I just wanted to put this in to acknowledge that the Qataris are doing a brilliant job. They've been doing a great job with the testing, and they have this outreach booth set up here in the what's it called? This near the Transport Mall and at the back of the training track, and they've got one set up in Esdan hotels, and I know they've been overwhelmed with a lot of athletes and coaches, doctors coming to actually do the wider quiz and get the prizes. But I just thought I'd put that up because they have been doing a fabulous job. It's not always wider doing the outreach. It's often the local organising committee, and these guys here have been doing a tremendous job. So please take the opportunity while you're here, go and visit one of these booths if you haven't got information, and take the information they have from there. Thank you.